Well, hi there. Here we are, chapter 14, now talking about audiobook narration. And what we're doing here is we're telling the long story when we're reading audiobooks. Audiobook narration requires exceptional reading skills and outstanding storytelling skills, with an ability to quickly adapt in real time to different vocal placements or attitudes for multiple characters during a scripted conversation. Most of the time, when you are reading an audiobook, you are the only voice that is being heard. So in order to tell the story, you have to have the ability to be able to have different sorts of expression, different sorts of inflection, making various distinctions between the different characters. Also have kind of an understanding of perspective. Perhaps if you're speaking for a character that's supposed to be far off in the distance, knowing how you can relate that sound with your voice. Doesn't have to be perfect. We're not asking you to do character voices per se here. We'll talk about that in chapter 15. But we are talking about trying to make that story come alive through your voice. Very much in a way that some people will read books out loud to children. Perhaps not as extreme as we might do for children, but you still want to create certain distinctions and be able to make that copy flow and create an interesting picture in the mind of the listener. You will need to be able to differentiate every character in the story. You'll also need to be able to accurately reproduce each character's vocal attitude or placement every time that the character appears in the story. Again, we're not talking about distinct character voices per se, but we are talking about bringing a certain tone and a certain attitude that the character is supposed to have and keeping a certain sense of consistency with that as you make those characters come to life within the scope of the story. You're going to want to read through the book several times. First time you read it through, you're getting a sense of the story. You're understanding what's happening, the plot and what happens, and preparing yourself in your mind for being able to read the narration and the characterizations, because it will help you to give your character's voice in light of a certain subtext that they may need to understand in the beginning of the story as a character, but doesn't really show up in the story itself to the listener until much later on. Second time you read through the story, you're going to want to identify and mark the scenes and the characters and the emotions, the story dynamics. Also develop your vocal treatments, how you are going to give voice to each of these things. The third time you read it through, usually this is going to be the recording session, or at the very least, it's going to be a rehearsal of your delivery, so that you can basically kind of get into your head, and if you're working with the producer, in their head as well, the way that this is going to go. So if you are doing just a rehearsal, then the fourth time you read it through will be the recording session. But by and large, once you've made those decisions on how you're going to do the read, you go ahead and go into the studio. In most cases, your delivery must be precisely accurate. It must be word for word as written. The reason for this is because people listen to audiobooks because they're interested in the book. They're interested in the way that the author writes. So you are not doing an adaptation of the book. You're doing the book. So it must be read verbatim. Match your delivery from the original when doing retakes. This is very important. You're keeping that characterization. You're keeping that attitude. You're keeping that delivery style so that it is consistent throughout the entire audiobook experience. Be careful of extra noises in the studio. Things like clothing movement, page turns, those sorts of things. You want to be very careful about that, because when it's just you and your voice, any sort of extra noise very well could wind up coming through into the recording. You're not generally going to have music in the background or the use of sound effects and things like that. It is just you. And people like a pure experience when they're listening to an audiobook, so they don't want extra noises or distractions in the background. How do you find an audiobook client? Well, marketing yourself as an audiobook narrator requires some special skills and knowledge. You're going to be expected to deliver a high-quality recording that is ready for publication. In other words, you are going to be handling every aspect of your recording, including quality control. You're going to be doing the editing. Many times you'll be doing the mastering, so that when you present your finished product, it truly indeed is a finished product. You have provided everything, and it is ready to go as is submitted. So you're going to want to be very careful in terms of how you record. If you're doing post-production and editing, you're going to want to, I would recommend taking notes on at what times you make mistakes and you want to edit things out. Write that down on a piece of paper and that sort of thing. And by the way, here's a tip for you. Whenever you are recording and you're just doing one long record and you're going back and editing later, number one, you do want to have a piece of paper with you and just jot down the time at which you want to go and make a particular edit, whether it's a mistake or a long pause or whatever. Then, when you are done recording, take that sheet of paper, and when you go through your audio editing software, work backwards. And the reason you want to do that is because if you're deleting things and you start at the beginning of your track, then the more you have to delete out, that's actually going to affect the times of the edits that you wrote down, because everything will shift over because when you're deleting content, you're shortening the time of the audio feed. So actually start backwards. Make your last edit point the latest time that you have. Make that the first thing that you take care of in the editing sequence, then work your way backwards, and that way your reference sheet that you have is going to be very helpful for you when you go to find those places that you need to delete out and that sort of thing. Audiobook companies, there are a few out there. Probably the most prominent one would be Audible, which is owned by Amazon, and they have a website called ACX where they connect authors of books with voiceover artists, and you see the website there on your screen. You're going to want to work with an author directly. If you don't use a website, maybe you're connected to someone that is writing a book and you'd like to work with that person. Find the book, get the rights for narration. So you do need to ask permission for these things because books are copyrighted works. Then promote the audiobook to various platforms. That's another way that you can go about it. Some other ideas. Audiobook Publishers Association is a good resource for those that want to get into this kind of work at audiopub.org. And there's also some more information available if you look at the link in your notes, an article from Hillary Huber on audiobook narration. You can click on that and read that if you want to learn more. Tips for performing audiobooks. First off, you must have excellent reading skills. You may be reading several pages at a time without a break. You have to be able to have that sort of endurance and be able to read for long periods of time with very few mistakes. You must be an exceptional storyteller and be able to create distinctions between characters and the narrator. You must have a thorough understanding of the story and the interrelationships of the characters. It's going to affect the way that you give voice throughout the read. The overall audiobook style is more of reading out loud than it is talking conversationally to one person. So this is one case where you're not necessarily presenting as if you are just talking to somebody casually. This is a case where you're truly trying to tell the story in the way that the author gave voice to it through the words on the page. So there's more theatrical dynamic to it. There's more interpretive skill to it. And sometimes that takes us out of that intimate one-on-one experience that we've talked a lot about throughout this course. Be prepared for long hours in front of the microphone and in editing your recordings. The longer the book, obviously, the longer the time you're going to be spending not just in front of the microphone, but also in front of the editing software. Finally, have an excellent home studio and a thorough understanding of your equipment, because you do want to make sure that you provide a clean, quality recording. So once again, at the end of this chapter, there's a few sample scripts I would encourage you to take a look at. Once you have done that, hop on over to the next video and we'll talk about characterization in chapter 15.